So big thanks, and I know she's not on. She kind of has a pretty good grip on closings. But big thanks to Janine for putting together most of this document, and April as well, because she sent me some stuff to include. Brandon helped out as well. So this was kind of a team effort, but I think it's really good. And it's especially good for folks who are newer in the business, because this is where a lot of things go sideways, right? And April knows, because she's there for it all the time. You know, when you first get in the business, it's like, hey, I got a client. That's exciting. I get to show houses. That's exciting. They want to write an offer. That's exciting. I got them under contract. That's exciting. Now what? Because, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg, getting under contract, right? Getting them across the finish line can sometimes be the biggest challenge. And I know that we can all relate to that, who have been in this even for, 6 months or so, because if you've had a closing, you know that it's not always easy. Now, some of them are, and that's great, but what we paid to do is get people over the finish line, not get them under contract, right? So our goal is to help remind them, hey, this was my initial goal. This is what I want to accomplish. Yeah, there are complications and speed bumps and things like that. We try to do a lot of work on that up front, right? When we set the expectations at the strategy session, to prepare people for what could happen. But our job after we get them under contract is to get them through the process. That's what April is there to help us make easier. But also, that's where we really do the hard work. And that's negotiating due diligence, walking them through the repair request, helping them understand what the inspection really says, right? There's always going to be items on that inspection, but just helping them understand that and prioritize the things that really should be. And that's where our expertise and our experience comes in. So let's kind of walk through this instead of me meandering through it. And I'd love your input as well. So please let me know your thoughts as we're going through this, and especially how it relates to your experience, because this is what it's all about. It's all about your experience, right? And how that helps everybody else. So your client's under contract. Now what? Now what do I do? This is fun. All right. Agent responsibility. So just as far as our setup goes, you guys should, recognize some of this stuff from the training, right? But also it's good to revisit. First and foremost is just making sure all the documents are there. We have to be compliant, and not just for our team compliant, but we got to be compliant for the real estate commission, right? We've got to make sure that we've got all the appropriate documents and that they're all executed correctly, because if they're not, then we don't actually have an agreement, right? You've seen examples, April, I'm sure. People will get under contract. Agent forgot to sign the agency agreement, right? I mean, you're not legally representing somebody. You forgot, you sent it to them to sign, but you forgot to sign it, right? Make sure you don't do that. Make sure you have all signatures for all parties. If you're representing a seller, make sure that both of the buyers or whoever signed and initialed every page on that offer to purchase before you move something to pending in MLS, right? In a lot of cases, make sure you get the due diligence before you move it to pending in MLS. So upload all the executed documents to the placeholder or the appropriate spot in dotloop, right? You want to archive or drag the executed document over the old copy of the document, right? You don't want to have multiple copies of the same form in your loop. There should only be one once you get to that certain point, right? You send it to your folks to sign, and then you downloaded it and emailed it to the listing agent as part of your offer. When you get the executed contract back, you want to make sure that you drop it over the document that only your clients had signed, right? Or you archive the documents that only your client have signed, because when April goes in there for compliance, or we go back in there to look later on, we only want to look to find one copy of that document, right? We don't want 4 copies of different things. That's also why we do different loops for the same folks if they make offers on separate properties, right? Just because we have to keep things clean like that. Super important. Make sure you're updating the status and that all of the things along the top of the loop are correct as well. It should pull the closing date and the purchase price from the fields in your loop, but make sure that it's there and make sure that you're updating the loop accordingly. Also, if you make an offer on a property and it doesn't get accepted, make sure you archive that loop, right? Because that's kind of there for posterity, right? The due diligence and earnest money instructions. Make it as clear as possible for people. We made that document, so we're trying to, with everything, but especially with this, make it as easy as possible for people to understand what their steps are, right? Outline it as clearly as possible. We have to always remember that although we do this every day, our people don't do this every day. So yeah, we understand due diligence and earnest money and where it goes and who has to see it and all that, because we tell people constantly about it, but the people aren't constantly hearing about it, right? So that's why we try to make it as clear as possible. Due diligence goes here, earnest money goes here. This is how much it's for. This is who you make it out to. Make sure that you take pictures of the checks. We need those. The lender needs those. The attorney wants those, all of those things. Make sure that you're communicating with your folks when they deliver the monies, and then you communicate it to the agent as well. And you communicate it to your lender, you communicate it to the attorney, all of those things. When it's delivered to the attorney, make sure that you reach out to them about getting page 16 back, signed by the attorney or the paralegal or whatever. I know Harrison is really good at that in Raleigh. Stephen, his assistant, always sends the earnest money, or I don't even have to ask for it. The other attorneys, just make sure that you're staying on top of it. Some are more on top of it than others. We need to make sure that we always have that stuff. The professional services, legally, we shouldn't be setting up closings, attorneys, inspections, warranties, any of that stuff until that is documented, right? So as soon as you get under contract, you drop those documents in the loop. The next thing is you need to populate that professional services disclosure based on the conversation that you've had with your clients, so April can take the next steps and set things up accordingly, right? So make sure that you're doing that, because that's her okay, or that's giving her the okay to go do her thing and what she does. It's also important to remember that different loan types will require different things. Like for a VA loan, well test is likely going to be needed if they're not on municipal water or something like that. So keep that in mind. Just going through these bullet points, make sure that you send a copy of the contract and all the disclosures and addendums to the attorney, right? They need all of those things. So don't forget to do that. Once you get everything in there and they've signed everything that they need to sign, submit the loop to the closing manager, April, so she can review and make sure that everything is in there and it's legit and things have been done the right way. Look at it this way. She's got your back. She wants to make sure that you have everything that you need so you can keep things moving in the right direction. Of course, you put it in Boomtown, you put it in CSU. Really, CSU is important for April as well, because she has all the contact information there for all of the people who are going to be involved, especially the cooperating agent, also the attorney, also the lender, those things. Any questions about this first part? This is really the agent responsibilities in the first section here, before we get on to really what April's doing and the closing manager is responsible for.
I just have a quick question about the amendment.
Yes.
When we have an amendment to the contract and maybe subsequent amendments, do we just drop the latest amendment into the loop and replace the previous one, or shall we keep all copies of previous amendments?
So for the amendments, those aren't really replacing each other because they're separate things. So I would
Okay.
keep in there. If you notice, and I know that this was in the group recently, for the amendment box or the amendment form, there's a box at the top of it that says which version it is. You should keep all of those and make sure that you number them separately and make sure that they're all there, right? Because each amendment can do different things. Like one amendment can be about you change the closing date. A second amendment could be now the seller's paying a concession, right? So make sure you keep all of them in there and that you number them accordingly. Good question, Eli. Thanks for asking that. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's move on to the closing manager responsibilities. So, of course, when you're working with buyers, you let them know that once they're under contract, April's going to be reaching out, right? We do this during the strategy session. Hey, one of the great things about working with us is we have an awesome closing manager who's going to help make sure that we're on top of this whole process from contract to close, because there's a lot that's involved. She's going to jump in and let you know that she's there to help with this stuff, but I'm still your primary point of contact, right? We're not handing you off to someone. We just have somebody else coming on board to help with the process. And make sure you articulate that too, because there are a lot of companies that once you get under contract, agent's gone, right? They just pass you off. I'm not there anymore. It's just like, hey, thanks. I'll see you at the closing table, or I'll see you at the walkthrough or whatever. That's not how we do things. April's here to help, check the boxes, line things up, etc. We're still the ones that are there to walk them through the rest of the process, right? Inspections, due diligence, all of that. So make sure that you know, or that you inform them what they should expect from April, but also remind them that, hey, I'm still your person. I'm not, just dropping you off with someone, right? So April is going to set up closing with the attorney. She's going to get us a time on that date that we've requested that's in the contract, right? And then she'll go about setting up the inspections that you've indicated in CSU that you need her to order, that the folks have indicated on the professional services disclosure that they want you to order, right? So don't forget about that. Just a side note with the professional services disclosure and kind of a reminder of how that document works is they're selecting or waiving the provider for the service that's on the form. If they waive a thing, they're not necessarily waiving the service, they're waiving the provider that's in the box. So you can always update that box, right? They want to use an inspector that's not our inspector, put that inspector in the box and have them select that inspector, right? Just as a reminder. As we all know, there are a lot of things on there that are going to be waived just because the North Carolina form, how often do you need a CPA? Right? There are several inspections that we don't order, right? And we tell those folks, I always tell my folks this, hey, yeah, there's roof inspection on here. There's HVAC inspection on here. I don't recommend those up front because I want to see what the home inspection says. And if the home inspection says, hey, you need somebody to take a look at the roof, then we're going to ask the seller to have somebody come out, right? I'm trying to save you money. I don't want you to necessarily have to pay for these things out of pocket. Now, if you're super OCD about the roof, or we see a reason to think that the roof needs an inspection right from the get-go, then yeah, we can do that. If we know there's a septic tank, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. If we know that we need a well test because it's a VA loan, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. But not necessarily everything is going to be done up front. Are we kind of all in agreement on that? Is that how you guys typically operate? Yeah. April, you got anything to comment on that?
I do. Can y'all hear me?
Uh-huh.
I would say most, if not, well, I'll say most all. I'm not even sure what to say. If it is not a vendor that is in the box, I don't know that many, if any, are going back and putting who they're actually using instead of the person in the box. And I don't know if that's super important because they've chosen that vendor, just say it's an HVAC or it's a survey, I can certainly, make that more of a priority if that is something that the commission would want us to do. But I guess that's a question for you and Brandon.
I think, best practices would be if you know who it's going to be, to edit the form and have them select versus just waiving. But if you don't, or if you know that they're not using that service, it's okay to waive it. The important thing, honestly, as far as the commission goes, is every line has to be initialed, right? And I know in the past, folks had maybe a misunderstanding, or they didn't, kind of recall from real estate school, and it was kind of their first go around that, okay, so we're not doing an HVAC inspection, we don't need to do anything on that line. That's not the case. The form isn't complete unless every line is initialed and every box is signed, right?
Okay.
Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah.
Doug and April, I don't order any inspections or do anything until I go over this document with my client, and I think that's the best way to do it, because to Doug's point, like in Raleigh, it says new leaf inspections. Well, if you have them sign that they want an inspection and you have new leaf in the box, but they use someone else, you've not done the form correctly. And so if you just discuss this with them and go line by line, Amber's heard me do this on the phone a million times. She can do the document now. She's heard me do it so much. You just fill it out as you go. And as soon as you get off the phone with them, send it to them to sign and say, just so you know, I can't book your inspections until you sign this. And I tell all of my clients, I want to get your inspections done within 3 to 5 business days. The time is of the essence. Please sign this. And if you have any further questions, we'll get right back on the phone. But discuss it with them and fill it out as appropriate, and then immediately send it to them to sign and tell them to go ahead and get with it, because technically you're not supposed to really do much of anything until that document is signed. And if you're moving forward and doing things out of order, technically you're doing something wrong. And if you don't think you'll ever get caught, all it takes is for one complaint and then they investigate everything, right? So just do it the right way to start with and get used to doing it that way.
Good points. Anybody else got anything on that, or questions or anything? New folks? Okay.
Sorry, I wanted to ask, so for future, when people decide to get squirrely after signing that in the beginning and say that they don't want XYZ, you need to go back in and change that when they change their mind and say, we actually do want these inspections. We have to go in and change it, correct?
I think that's a best practice.
Okay.
Yeah. If somebody changes their mind about, say, hey, now I want a roof inspection.
Should we keep those as 2 separate documents then?
Holly, I think it's okay to have the updated one. I think
Okay.
it's to have
Doug,
the most.
the way that I've done that in the past, just because, there's a timestamp on all this stuff. Holly,
Yep.
what I've done in the past is I would download it from the loop and save it as a PDF. Then I would upload the PDF in place of the one that's in the loop and then add the new text boxes. That way there's a timestamp on everything correctly. So
Okay.
as an example, if you have a home inspection and you don't do a roof, because the inspector should be looking at the roof, and the inspector comes back and says, this thing's a disaster, you're definitely going to need, or you're going to want to check this out. Then you get a roof inspector, right? You go back and add that later, and the timestamp will show that you did it when you found out you needed to. That's the
Okay.
way that I've always done it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
That's a really good point. Yep. I think that's a good idea. I mean, we have these timestamps and things for a reason, right? So we've got a paper trail. Basically, it's a digital paper trail. So that's a good idea. So moving on, it's not just you as the agent and April as the closing manager that have things that they're responsible for, right? The client is also responsible for things. And like with all things that we talk about, we're the professional. They're relying on us to guide the ship. That's why they come to us, right? They don't know how to do this. So what value are you providing? Well, part of the value is you have to let them know, hey, this is what's next. And this is what your responsibility is at this point. So just a reminder about a couple of things. Sometimes we need a power of attorney, right? We need to make sure that we have that as soon as possible. Maybe one person can't attend closing, maybe neither of them. can attend closing, but somebody's going to do it for them. Make sure that you're aware of that and you get that lined up as soon as possible, right? And that everybody has that lender, attorney, all of those things. Now, our attorneys can draw up a power of attorney really easily, not that expensive when it's needed. But here's the thing, not in every situation, a lender isn't going to allow a power of attorney necessarily to work, right? So you need to make sure that you talk about that with the lender if you've got a situation where, you know, maybe both parties can't attend closing or something like that. Any
Hey,
questions about that?
Doug, one thing I'll add to power of attorney is when I have a power of attorney, I always have the attorney draft the document and send me a PDF of it first. I send that directly to their loan officer and have the loan officer approve the power of attorney, because I've been in situations before where the blanket power of attorney that worked for one transaction where we just swapped the names out, the lender had a problem with that. And so I would advise you to take that extra step, because if you have a power of attorney drafted, you don't run it by the lender, the buyer or seller sign it, and then the attorney files it, and come to find out the lender won't accept it. You just wasted a week, right?
Yep.
And they're going to be unhappy with you.
Yep. If you're needing one of these things, you need to get it done up front quickly and get it in front of everybody so they have a chance to look at it, to make sure everybody's on the same page about what they need and what's acceptable. Because attorneys are generally going to use a template that they have, but different lenders have different expectations.
You do not want to be at the closing table waiting for wet signature power of attorney to
That is
come in.
That's 100% right.
Mercy of FedEx.
100%. Thanks for sharing that. So, you know, make sure really that's a big thing up front. The other thing is, hey, now's the time that you're going to be shopping for your home insurance, things like that. You know, if you have a loan, you have to have insurance. Almost every lender these days, at least for a primary residence, are going to require that you escrow for your insurance and your taxes, right? So go ahead and make sure that they are talking to people and setting that up. It seems to me that every time we have a buyer info sheet, the last thing that gets filled out is the insurance information, right? Because people aren't necessarily sure who they're going to be using. And I get that, but that's why you have to get on it up front. All right, we're under contract. Here's our insurance person. Talk to them or talk to your own person, but you got to get rolling on that, because the attorney needs it, the lender needs it. They got to run the numbers. They got to get everything set up so they know, based on your whatever plan you pick, everything is set up correctly. Any questions about that? All that stuff is in the loop as a reminder, so it's easy to share. You should do that as part of professional services disclosure, all that. Now, mentioning the professional services disclosure, almost always waive that insurance box, right? Because people don't know who they're going to use right after we go under contract. And that's okay, but you need to make sure that you're communicating at least what their options are and that they need to do it. And that's why we have our insurance folks stuff right there in the loop to easily share with them. So at least we've given them the option and made sure that they're aware that, hey, you got to do this next. Any questions about that? And of course, the big thing, which makes the contract really, really official, is delivering the due diligence and the earnest monies. Now, a lot has changed in the 8 years that I've been in the business, because everything was basically done by check when I first started, but now we got people Venmoing money. We got people wiring money, you know. So you need to really make sure that you're talking with your client about their expectations for how they're going to deliver it before you just check the box and send it to them. Raise your hand if you just check the personal check box and then you got under contract and your client was like, oh, I don't have personal checks.
I've done it.
Yeah. Right. A lot of people don't have personal checks these days, you know,
Especially if they're under 35.
I know April still writes a check when she goes to Food Lion for her groceries, but not everybody does. Sorry, I have to make April jokes. Anyways, make sure that you talk about that with your folks so you're setting expectations. And so the contract actually reflects how the money's being delivered, because technically if somebody wanted to get really persnickety and something goes sideways in 3 weeks from contract date, if you got personal checkbox checked and then you Venmo them the money, well, you're technically in breach of contract. Right?
Question.
Yep.
We are still allowed to check more than one box to be fair. Like we can do personal check or certified check at the same time, correct?
Let's look at the document and see what it
Okay.
says. My understanding is that you should only check one box.
Yeah.
Let me see what the
I
document.
usually tell people to just go to the bank and get a certified check.
Yep.
Because that's going to be the safest across the board for everybody. But I remember when I first started, there was a moment that we could check more than one box, but maybe that is wrong now.
Let's be sure, as with all things, it's best to look at the document. So give me just a second. I personally have never checked more than one box. I'm fairly certain. And of course, now Dotloop is making me confirm my real estate license number and all those things. Because now is a perfect time to do that. Bear with me.
You want me to pull one up and read it?
That's what I'm doing. It's just Dotloop wasn't being cooperative. Give me just a second. I'm almost there.
While you're talking about this, can I share one thing from a broker in charge standpoint?
Yes.
I dealt with this last week and it was a nightmare. If your buyer wants to send a wire to the seller for due diligence, I would advise against that just because some banks are persnickety about how quickly they send wires, what they do with wires. Long story short, state employees, and I bank there, so I can say this, they suck in a variety of ways. Like the name on the wire that my client sent the seller, we didn't have their middle initial, so they held the wire for 48 hours to figure out if it was, if something weird was going on or not. And so everybody was upset. It took us 24 hours to figure out if they even received the wire, and then they held it in another account. If you have to do that, please explain to your client how problematic that this can be. And I would not want to be the one to get the wire information from the seller, their routing and account number, and then send that to the buyer. Because if anything bad goes south, you're the one that exchanged the information. And so I would really encourage you to not, just like we don't share wire information for attorneys, we allow the seller or the closing attorney to do that. I would not get in the habit of transferring the seller's bank account information to the buyer to send a wire. There's just too many bad things that can happen. And if one thing goes wrong, it's technically your fault.
I mean, that's an excellent point, and I can relate because I had buyers that wired money to a seller for the due diligence, and it got kicked back because they made the wire out to both sellers, just like it was on the contract, right? And that's what I instructed them to do because I didn't know otherwise. Only the wife was on the bank account. So because the husband's name was on the wire, it got kicked back, and then they had to resubmit it. And, that wasn't our fault, but we didn't know. The biggest thing, I mean, because that can be overcome, right? It's not our fault if it gets kicked back, we can resend it or whatever. The biggest thing is sharing wire information. And there's a reason we don't do that. In the cases where somebody is going to be wiring money and you're sharing that information, do not type anything. Screenshot it directly. Do not retype the account number. Do not retype the routing number. If anything, all you're doing is screenshotting or forwarding an email that says, see below from whoever sent it to you, right? That's it. Never, ever, ever type numbers, ever, because you get one transposed, flip-flopped, money goes somewhere else. That money ain't coming back. It's your fault, right? So make sure that you never do that. And just avoid it altogether if possible. And same thing with Venmo, honestly. I mean, a username can be one character off and then that money's gone. So make sure that you explain to your clients the risk if they're insistent on doing that because they used their last check at Food Line yesterday.
If I ever have a client that wants to do that again, I'll tell them that if they do it, they have to call the seller personally and get the information from them. I can't facilitate that as firm policy. But if you have someone doing Venmo or Cash App or something like that for due diligence payment, Jesus, my dogs, you need to check with their lender first and make sure that their lender allows that before you agree to do it.
That's an excellent point as well. Make sure it's okay with the lender to do that. Thank you, Brandon. All right, moving on, the DD deadline and request. So this has been an important thing to be aware of as of late, but always. As soon as the home inspection report is back, discuss with the buyer what they want to have addressed and get the due diligence request agreement submitted to the list agent with a copy of the home inspection, right? In time to allow a response before the DD deadline. You don't need to be submitting it the day of the deadline, right? People need time to think about a request, to get quotes for things, etc. If you're representing a seller, you don't want the due diligence request the day that the DD expires, right? So make sure that you're operating that way when you're representing buyers. Conversely, if you're representing a seller and you get a DD request, get on it, figure it out. Don't sit on this thing. You know, I know that some agents in our business, and we have all encountered them or we will, like to try to string things out to put people in a situation where they think they can force them to make a decision. Don't operate that way. Don't operate that way. Okay. Move in plenty of time that people have time to make decisions and to weigh everything and to get all the information they need. Be proactive. Get ahead of the ball. Remind the buyers that, as we discussed in the sellers or in the strategy session, that sellers aren't required to fix anything in North Carolina. In North Carolina, there's no such thing as a pass or fail home inspection. It's for informational purposes only. Now, some loan types will require that some things be fixed before the lender will approve the loan. For example, an issue with termites or a VA loan or something like that. They're going to require a clear pest inspection or a clear WDIR, right? So make sure that you're aware of that and that you're informing people appropriately. If the seller offers a credit, you need to make sure that you notate that on the due diligence request. So in lieu of repair, seller to do X credit, but then you also need to do the amendment. I know that we just talked about some things needing to be clean on inspection reports for lenders, but you never share the due diligence request with the lender, right? They don't want to see it. They're not interested in it, right? The only things that they're going to be interested in is if something comes up on an appraisal, which for a VA loan is pretty much like a home inspection. Any questions about any of that or any comments?
I did have maybe a technical question about the VA appraisal and a home inspection report and how those two things kind of meld together or kind of are distinct items that don't really come together at any point. I read that in regards to termites, the appraisal inspection could order one if, or order an inspection if they see an issue. In best practice, we would always want a pest inspection to be done. So I was curious, in terms of interacting with the lender, where does that requirement actually sit on, and whose responsibility is it? Is it the prospective buyers doing their due diligence? Is it with the appraiser? Or is there really kind of a dual responsibility there?
So it can be both. So for using VA, for example, they're going to send the appraiser out, but the appraiser is also doing more than a drive-by appraisal.
Mhm.
You're getting like a conventional loan. I mean, it was hilarious to me, not hilarious, kind of weird to me. During COVID, they were doing drive-by appraisals. Like they weren't even going in the houses. If you can't tell me how worthless your job is that you can drive by the house and appraise it, what's the point? I mean, this is a complete sham, and you're going to appraise it right at list price or a contract price or whatever anyways. But in the case of something like a VA loan where they are actually inspecting the property, then either they may point out things that need to be fixed. Same thing with FHA or something like that. We've seen that too. Or they may request, as has happened to me recently, hey, we need the WDIR. Do you have it yet? And we had to say, we're still working on that because the WDIR came back and it wasn't clear. So, they're working on getting it cleared. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess maybe just a follow up there. It seems like the minimum requirements for the appraisal on a VA loan are somewhat stringent, but it didn't. I guess maybe the question is, and we can table this as just kind of my thought, which is, so they're probably not crawling in the crawl space looking for subterranean termites per se, but looking at adjacent damage or something like that. Is that maybe a correct assumption?
It is for conventional loan. I wouldn't say that it is for something else necessarily.
The VA appraisal is going to be the most intense in my experience. Pretty much any lender, Eli, with a VA loan, you're always going to have to submit a clean pest report. And so if you get a pest report back that shows evidence of termites in any shape, form, or fashion, it's immediately on the agent to start working on either negotiating that to be completed or the buyer sucking it up and paying for it. If it's got termites, a VA loan, they're not going to fund the loan. And, the VA wants that fixed, and they quite frankly don't care who fixes it. So if the seller won't pay to get it fixed and the buyer wants the house, the VA loan, you lose your DD, but you get your earnest money back regardless. But sometimes I've had sellers on or buyers on VA loans that have had to pay for repairs. A lot of figuring out what a VA appraiser is looking for that can ding the loan and hold up funding is learning by experience. As an example, I had a VA loan held up one time by an appraiser because one of the electrical outlets on the wall, the outlet cover was cracked in half. It was broken. I've had them held up before because there was no outlet cover on the wall for the electrical outlet. So with a VA loan, you have to be as peculiar as possible if you know your client is using a VA loan when you're checking the house out before you make the offer, because you need to be aware of the things that a VA appraiser may ding it for. I had one held up one time on VA because there was no vapor barrier at all. The seller said, we ain't doing it. So my buyer paid for the vapor barrier. We had to provide, we had to provide evidence of that. And so just be aware of that. But ultimately, it's our job to make sure it gets done, not the appraiser.
Got it. Yep.
I think
Understood.
the biggest thing that we run into, especially on the coast, is just wood rot. I mean, I feel like we deal with that at least one out of three. So, I mean, that's a big one to look for. If you see that, that's a big red flag.
Dings in siding or dents or holes in siding. But like most list agents are, well, in my experience out here, most list agents are they're tracking that they have to get these things taken care of once we recognize it and we send them, or, we get the not clean WDIR back. Most list agents are on it and they will get it taken care of.
This is squirreling a bit, but it's really good information. If you are representing a seller and you get an offer for a VA or FHA, you have to set the expectations for what could be required by the lender for them to approve that loan, and put your seller in a position where they're not blindsided by the fact that they have to make a repair if they want to move forward with that. Now, the caveat with that is during COVID, and I'll straight up say it, agents were recommending their folks to stay away from VA loans, which is completely unethical. It's not you're warning people to stay away from VA loans. You need to just make sure that they're aware of what could be required if you accept an offer that's funded by the VA. Does that make sense, that differentiation? But some people were straight up just telling people no VA loans, which is completely not right. So just make sure that you remember both sides of the coin and that you advise your clients accordingly, right? All right, I hope that was helpful. Thanks everybody for your participation in that part of it. Getting back to the DD part, any questions about that? One thing to remember is get the appraisal back before the due diligence deadline expires. Make sure that your folks, or first make sure that you let the lender know that you're under contract and get them a copy of the contract so they can get with your buyer about paying for the appraisal, which they have to do before they can schedule the appraisal. And sometimes appraisals take a while before the people will come out. During COVID, if you had a house like under $200,000 and it wasn't in Wake County, appraisers just wouldn't accept it. They were so busy, you couldn't get an appraiser to go out. You guys remember that? And how terrible that was? It's like, we can't find an appraiser, which just seems ridiculous, especially if they're just going to drive by anyways. But that point maybe is a little moot. You have to make sure that you're being proactive with your folks. And part of that is making sure the lender knows we're under contract and has a copy of it so they can get with your folks and get it settled and set up. Make sure that you're communicating with the lender. Hey, is the appraisal scheduled yet? Hey, when is it? Hey, when do we expect it back? Because they usually have an expected back date, right? And then also make sure that that date is before your due diligence deadline. Now, in some cases, you want that appraisal back before you even submit the DD request, right? In some cases, you want to submit the DD request right away and you don't care about the appraisal. It really just depends, but you have to be aware of all that, right? So you can approach things the right way. Any questions or conversations about that? You can still make a DD request after the DD deadline. You can still negotiate after the DD deadline. You can still do an amendment after the DD deadline. Repairs can be done after the DD deadline. They don't have to be done before that, right? But the seller isn't required to do any of that stuff if it's not documented. So make sure that it's documented, right? And in most cases, or in all cases, it's better really to get it documented before the end of the DD deadline, even if there's not earnest money, right? Just make sure that you always operate in the correct order. Any questions or thoughts on that?
I've had list agents say, we'll talk about the DD request after we get the appraisal back, after you get the appraisal back.
Yep.
And that one stings, but you have to deal with it. You have no control. That's
right. And if they say that, then sometimes you got to say, all right, well, then we need to extend the DD deadline. If that's what you want, then we need to do that. In some cases, your buyer's got $10,000 in due diligence and no earnest money, and you really don't have a choice. You know, you're just working on, we're trying to get through this together, right? And sometimes you can still get repairs done even with all that and no earnest money. And sometimes you can't, because they're going to say, you know, we got your 10K. We're not going to do any repairs. If you want to walk, right? It really just depends. No two instances are always the same, but you just have to be in a position to be able to inform your folks and do the best you can with it, right? This business is really funny because we make these blanket statements and we have these approaches, but every situation is completely different, right? So you have to know how to do it, but you also have to know other ways to do it and be nimble and flexible too. That's why we go to the great lengths of setting the expectations before we get to this point and why that's so important, right? Okay. Moving on, because I know you guys have stuff to do. Clear to close. So now we're supposed to have the CD or, the document 3 days before closing. On average, how many people have it always 3 days before closing? Never, right? Never. But make sure that you're staying in front of it. Make sure that when the lender sends it to you or the attorney sends it to you, that you also have April look at it and that you look at it to make sure that the credits are correct on there for due diligence, earnest money, or any other seller concessions, or the price is right, that your commission's right. All of that stuff is important to check. That's part of our job, right? But you're not communicating to your client what that number is supposed to be. That comes from the lender, that comes from the attorney, that does not come from you. You want to make sure that they are aware when they should expect to get it and who it should come from. And you need to set the expectation that you need to wire the money the day before closing, not the day of closing, because that could delay things, right? And that they know who to expect the wire information from or where to go to get it, because it's not going to come from you, right? Any other questions about that? I use a lot of caps in this paragraph because it's very important. So make sure that you're aware of that. I don't like to yell in text, but sometimes, we're trying to make a point because I'm trying to cover your butts. I don't want you to get in trouble. Right? All right, fair enough. Utilities, these are important. I remember I closed on a house one time, and this was before I was in real estate, and the sellers had cut the service the day of closing. So we got to the house and didn't have any power, and it's a Friday. So guess what? We're not going to have power for the whole weekend. Part of our responsibility, and one of the great things April does, is letting people know, hey, don't forget to get the utilities put in your name. Now, God bless, I've got a great client right now. 3 weeks from closing, he's like, should I go ahead and call and get my utilities set up? And I'm like, hold up, we're still kind of going back and forth because the closing date is going to change. I wouldn't do that quite yet, but I love it when a client's thinking proactively like that, and make sure, he got to it before I even got to it in the conversation. But it is also part of the strategy session, so make sure that you touch on that. The sellers should have the services on through the day of closing, right? But you should also tell your folks to get them put in their name the day of closing. So you've got a little bit of overlap, just in case. Because what costs the most isn't turning the utilities on. It's if they have to go back out and turn them on, not switching them over, but turning them on, right? Like if somebody has to physically go out there, that's what costs the most and takes the most time too. So just make sure that they're aware and they do that in advance. Any questions about that? Okay. Final walkthrough. This is kind of important, right? We want to make sure the house is still there and that things were done the way that they were supposed to be done. So always schedule your final walkthrough for the morning of closing or the day before, if possible. Try not to take it or do it before that. If there's an instance where your buyer can't attend the final walkthrough, I think it's a good best practice to have it documented that, hey, we're waiving our opportunity to do a final walkthrough, and save that email or text or whatever it is in your loop for posterity, right? Even if your folks waive it, you should still go. That's part of our job, is to make sure that we're doing a last look at the house. So make sure that you're there, or, if it's one of those times where you're out of town, you can't help it, have a teammate go, please, right? You don't want them to go sign paperwork to buy something that burned down overnight and nobody knew about it because everybody's out of town, right? Any questions about that? Closing. You should want to go to closing. That's the best part. It's closed, right? So go there and show up for your folks and be there to support them and congratulate them. We don't do anything at closing. We let the attorney make their jokes or whatever, and we laugh at the jokes that we've heard 15 times before. And that's okay. Our attorneys are great. I can almost do the script myself at this point, but you're not there for that. You've already done your work. You're there, to congratulate them and get a picture. which is always fun too. And hand them the keys, because you shouldn't give them the key from the lockbox until they sign. Any questions about that?
I just had a quick question about arranging for key exchange from the
Yep.
listing agent to my folks. What does that look like in kind of just general terms?
So typically it's one of two things, or it could be a combination. Either the attorney has all the keys and they'll give it to you after you sign, or they'll say, come back and get the keys after the deed's recorded, or you just take the key from the lockbox and then you give it to them after they sign the documents, and you tell them, hey, I'll let you know when the deed's recorded. Don't go in the house until I let you know the deed's recorded, which an attorney will tell you. And at my last closing did say that unless they tell you not to go in the house, it's okay to go in the house. And that means the seller tells you it's not okay to go in the house. But I think best practices, it's always good just to make sure that things are recorded. And our attorneys typically, I think, do a really good job of sending an email out to all the involved parties that say, hey, we're on record.
Eli, I
And that-
usually text the list agent. Sorry, Doug.
No, go ahead.
I usually text the list agent like the day or two before closing and ask them how they like to handle keys, because they're in control of the keys, period. And if they are very adamant that they do not want anybody entering that house, they will tell you.
Yep, that's 100% true. Good point. Thank you
Got
for sharing. I hope that
Thank you.
answered your question. All right, so just, wrapping up our systems. Once it's closed in Boomtown, go edit the transaction, right? Change it to close, make sure the numbers and dates are all correct. Move your folks to closed as far as their status in Boomtown. Send your review request email template, which everyone should have one of, which links to our Google pages, your Zillow profile, and then Yelp and some other pages as well. Any questions about that? In Sisu, go edit the transaction and just make sure that all the fields are correct. Mostly the main thing I see is people forget to go in and edit that the price was changed or something like that because of concessions for DD requests or something like that. So just make sure that that's all accurate, because if that's off, it's going to throw off what you have for your commission numbers in there as well, right? The price changes from 450 to 445 or whatever, it's going to throw things off. So just make sure that the math is correct and all of that. And then and dot loop, of course, you submit the loop for review again after closing, but make sure that you've got all the documents in the appropriate places and the appropriate folders and the appropriate placeholders, and that you don't have multiple copies of things that there shouldn't be multiple copies of, because that's just going to make it harder for April to find everything and give you the clear green light for compliance. Any questions?
I do have a quick question about utilities. Is there a little cheat website out there anywhere that can hone in on an area or a address and just give a rundown of available
There's
utilities?
actually a document in the loop in the closed folder that
Mhm.
has utilities for our area that's in
Got
there.
it. I did see that, but these more obscure areas like Siler City.
Unfortunately, your first one was outside of the info sheet that we had, so I had to
Yeah,
go and do some digging for that one.
that's okay. I hunted them down as well. I'm still waiting back for the trash provider, but it just takes a couple phone calls and we'll get that sheet updated to include Siler City. How's that sound?
That's why on the listing side, when we do listings, we have a utility sheet that the sellers can fill out that we that we include. So people are aware of that, but not everybody does that. So sometimes, you have to ask, because we do get some of these far-flung areas.
Yep.
Good question. Anybody else? So this is probably our longest ever mastermind session, and it just goes to show you how important and how much work goes into it after you get under contract. So hopefully recapping this, documenting this, putting it out there will help folks stay ahead of it, remind you of what you need to focus on and what you need to get done and who's responsible for what, because we're all wheels in the machine, right? there are different people that do different things to help everybody get to their ultimate goal, and that's across the closing finish line. Anybody have anything else that we missed or that they have questions about? Keep this document handy, especially if you're just doing this for the first couple of times, because it'll help you figure out and build that muscle memory so you don't forget when you get down the line. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. See you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Hi.